Now come to the Ministerial Statement. Secretary of State for Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs on COVID-19 update. Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the Prime Minister has said, the coronavirus pandemic is the worst public health crisis for a generation. It is unsettling for families up and down the country and in all of our constituencies, so we need a united effort to tackle COVID-19 effectively and to come through this challenge, as I am confident that we can and will. Following on from and consistent with the domestic measures announced by the Prime Minister yesterday, and based on the fast-changing international circumstances, today I am announcing changes to FCO travel advice. Mr. Speaker, UK travellers abroad now face widespread international border restrictions and lockdowns in various countries. The FCO will always consider the safety and the security of British nationals. So with immediate effect, I have taken the decision to advise British nationals against non-essential travel globally for an initial period of 30 days and, of course, subject to ongoing review. Now, Mr. Speaker, I should emphasise this decision has been taken based on the domestic measures introduced here in the UK, alongside the changes to border and a range of other restrictions which are now being taken by countries right around the world. The speed and the range of those measures across other countries is unprecedented. Some of those decisions are being made without notice. In some countries, even in countries or particular areas where there haven't yet been any reported cases of COVID-19, local authorities are nonetheless imposing restrictions on movement, and again doing so with little or sometimes no notice whatsoever. In light of those circumstances, we want to reduce the risk of leaving vulnerable British tourists or travellers stranded overseas. We will, of course, keep this advice under review and amend it as soon as the situation responsibly allows. Now, the Government, of course, is keenly aware that international freight services, such as shipping and haulage, are vital for ensuring the continuity of the supply of essential food, goods and material to the UK. So we do regard this kind of travel as essential, and we will work with industry to issue detailed advice which maintains the flow of goods whilst protecting the well-being of staff who are working on those routes. The Department for Transport will be leading this work with the freight sector with the objective of minimising disruption to those routes as far as is possible. At the same time, Mr. Speaker, FCO consular teams are working round the clock to provide the best and the most up-to-date information that we can possibly provide to UK nationals. Just by way of context, in the last week alone, we have made over 430 changes to FCO travel advice, and we will obviously continue to keep it under close and constant review. We're providing support to British nationals who have been impacted by coronavirus while travelling. During the initial outbreak or containment phase, we arranged the repatriation of more than 200 vulnerable British nationals from China between the 31st of January and the 9th of February. And we took that particular action, Mr. Speaker, to support British nationals and control the return of those possibly exposed to COVID-19 at the earliest point in the crisis, when it appeared that the virus might be contained in China. In other cases, like the British nationals affected by COVID-19 infection in the hotel in Tenerife, we worked with travel companies and airlines to ensure that those concerned were safely brought home. Mr. Speaker, we also changed our travel advice to advise people over 70 or with underlying health conditions against travelling on cruises to protect the most at risk from coronavirus. And we have arranged repatriation from cruise ships, including most recently 131 UK nationals who returned from the Grand Princess, which was docked in California, and they arrived home last Wednesday. On the issue of cruises, we've been working intensively with the Cuban authorities and Fred Olsen Cruise Lines to ensure that all of the British nationals are able to return quickly and safely to the UK. In relation to, that's of course the Bremer cruise liner. We're doing all we can to ensure that they return to the UK on flights from the Jose Marti International Airport in Havana within the next 48 hours. I spoke to the Cuban Foreign Minister twice over the weekend, and we are very grateful to the Cuban government for swiftly enabling this operation and for their close cooperation to make sure it could be successful. As well as those repatriations, UK consular teams are working with those who are affected by difficult quarantine conditions, the closure of tourist resorts, for example, in Europe and North Africa, or indeed just when there are new regulations that are introduced in countries where British nationals are visiting. We will do everything in our power to get those British nationals affected the care, the support and the practical advice that they need. Mr. Speaker, we also need to be clear about our capacity to repatriate people from abroad, given the scale of the numbers. We have taken action where necessary, but no one should be under any illusions. It is costly, it is complicated to coordinate, so government-supported repatriations have only been undertaken in exceptional circumstances. Ultimately, the primary responsibility for managing outbreaks of COVID-19 and quarantine measures must rest with the country in which the outbreak has occurred. SCO teams around the world are working urgently to ensure that governments have sensible plans to enable the return of British and other travellers, and crucially, to keep borders open for sufficient period to enable returns to take place on commercial flights wherever that's possible. Following today's change in travel advice, British nationals who decide that they still need to travel abroad should do so fully aware of the increased risks of doing so. And that obviously includes the risk that they may not be able to get home if travel restrictions are subsequently put in place that they hadn't anticipated. So we urge anyone still considering travel to be realistic about the level of disruption they are willing and able to endure, and to make decisions in light of the unprecedented conditions that we face. Mr. Speaker, today's travel guidance follows the domestic measures announced yesterday. It forms part of our national effort to meet the international challenge presented by coronavirus, a challenge we will rise to as a government, as a country, and I commend this statement to the House.
Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Secretary of State for advance sight of his statement. We hear what he says on freight, but could he give us any guidance on what is essential travel when it comes to people? Does it include people coming home? This is a time of immense concern for tens of thousands of British nationals stranded abroad, not just dealing with the stress of trying to get accurate information and make their way home, but doing so facing the ever-present fear of infection. I was contacted yesterday by Tom, one of the 65 British nationals in Cusco, Peru, and which has announced a 15-day state of emergency with its borders closed and the army enforcing a quarantine. Tom's flight to Britain today has been cancelled, and his calls to our embassy in Lima have not been answered. And why is that? Because the embassy itself has decided to close down for 15 days just when its services were needed most. The Secretary of State said in his statement that our consular teams are working around the clock to provide the best information available to UK nationals. Well, I'm afraid that simply isn't the case in Tom's experience. We have received no advice or assistance, he says. We are all extremely concerned at being stranded here. Across the world, there are tens of thousands of British nationals in the same position as Thomas, and all with the same message for the British government: help bring us home. As far as we're concerned, our travel is essential. And it is no use telling them to rely on advice from the governments in the countries that they are travelling, when our tourists will inevitably be the least of those countries' concerns. Nor is it any use telling them to rely on the instructions of their travel operators, which have all too often in recent weeks been at odds with the official FCO travel advice and driven by the fear of insurance claims and bankruptcy, not by the needs of our citizens. The government cannot keep passing the buck to others, especially when it comes to repatriation. Yes, it's difficult. Yes, it's expensive. But that is the nature of the crisis that we face. So I ask the Secretary of State in his response directly to address Tom and his compatriots in Peru and all other British nationals around the world currently in the same position, and tell them what he is doing to help bring them home. Can I ask the Secretary of State to reassure us today that the Foreign Office will learn the lessons from this fiasco by asking itself some very basic questions? First, why were there no clear protocols already in place on the plans for evacuation and repatriation in the event of an outbreak such as this? And if those protocols were in place, why were they not followed? Second, Why has official travel advice from the FCO been so slow to match what is happening on the ground, to the extent that this weekend we had tour operators going door to door in French ski resorts telling British families to leave immediately, whilst the Foreign Office website said that there were no restrictions on travel? And third, most basically, as Tom's case in Peru illustrates, will the Foreign Secretary determine why the levels of consular support have been so out of step with the levels of global demand? Mr. Speaker, when the dust settles on this crisis, as we all hope it eventually will, we will reflect on what has been a chronic failure of global leadership and coordination in which our own government has sadly been one of the parties. Instead of every country working together to agree best practice and apply common standards on testing, tracking and travel restrictions, on quarantines, self-isolation and social distancing, we have instead seen a global free-for-all when every country has been going it alone. And instead of the international community coming together to pool its experience and work together to develop a vaccine and a cure, we have again seen individual companies and countries working in silos. And the shameful attempt by Donald Trump to buy the German company in the lead when it comes to discovering a vaccine, not just to steal the glory of the vaccine for himself, but to hoard it for the Americans alone. Mr. Speaker, the challenges posed by coronavirus are fearful enough for the world without our leaders compounding them through their incompetence or their inaction. We have seen exactly that when it comes to this government's approach to repatriation, but it is part of a pattern which goes far beyond that one issue and far beyond our one country. So in closing, will the Secretary of State undertake today that, as well as fixing the immediate issues we face with the coronavirus, not least around repatriations, but that Britain will also lead the way in ensuring that these outbreaks are better managed in future?
Can I thank the Honourable Lady for her response, at least in relation to recognising the scale of the challenge. She asked a number of questions, and I'll try and give her as much of a substantive response as I can. She asked about what essential or non-essential travel means. Ultimately, the way travel advice is given by the Foreign Office is that the decision on whether to travel is nonetheless remains an individual decision. Travellers may have urgent, particularly exceptional business, family or commercial or otherwise, and circumstance may differ. But what we are doing is strongly advising against travel globally, and that's partly a reflection of the measures domestically that were announced yesterday around social distancing, but also because we want to limit the number of people, particularly vulnerable people, that find themselves in the plight of not being able to get home because of some of the issues that she's raised. She mentioned the team in the, I think it was the Philippines, in Peru. And the team is working as best it can under very difficult conditions. I'm very happy to take away and look at the case that she's referred to. We have a whole range of practical advice for MPs, honourable members of this House, to give advice to their constituents. Our FCO travel advice is obviously available online. Honourable members and indeed their constituents can sign up to receive email updates so they get it in real time, and my officials also run a specific hotline for honourable members to contact. I've also shared details with honourable members in a Dear Colleague letter which will go out shortly today. So we're doing everything we can to give honourable members on all sides the practical information that they need in what is obviously a very fast-moving and fluid situation. The Honourable Lady asked what we're doing more generally in relation to helping people to get back home. The first thing to say is to avoid travel where you might find yourself in a situation, either because of current measures or future measures, that you're unable to get back home. We are also liaising with the tour operators and the airlines to make sure that even when restrictions are in place, that there is a window of opportunity to get out with commercial flights. Given the volume, we don't have precise numbers, but the volume of people, British nationals who are abroad, not permanently, not living abroad necessarily, but travelling abroad, to expect that the government can repatriate them all, I think would be unrealistic. What we do is make sure that we're in a position to protect the most vulnerable. She asked why our consular teams are stretched. I have to say to the Honourable Lady, she ought to have a look at the scale of the international challenge this country and everyone is facing with COVID-19. And the teams across government, but including the consular teams in the Foreign Office, doing an exceptional job in very difficult circumstances. The Honourable Lady is right to point to different measures that have been taken around the world. The UK approach is to follow the best scientific advice that we've got, and also to deal with and take measures, both domestic measures and international measures, in line with trying to reduce the peak of the coronavirus in the UK, the number of infections, and also make sure we maximise the capacity of the NHS to deal with it. Finally, she did her usual routine of sniping at the US President. I have to say that is no substitute for a serious question on the substance, let alone a serious policy answer.
Sir Peter Bottomley.
As the Honorary President of the British International Freight Association, can I thank the Foreign Secretary for his words about the freight forwarders and their job in keeping goods moving in and out of the country. Can I raise two other brief issues with him? One is, can he encourage both the Foreign Commonwealth Office and the tour operating airlines to have easily accessible websites so that tourists who may be stuck in the Dominican Republic or elsewhere can actually get information on what's likely to happen to them? And lastly, can I say to him, there are some countries where you have to apply for a business visa to go to a business meeting, up to £600 for India. And if they suddenly decide they're not issuing visas, can he encourage their High Commissioner and government to actually make that possible to be transferred to a future arrangement, rather than just take the money and forget about it?
Can I thank my right honourable friend? I think he raised a number of very important points. We are liaising with tour operators, insurance companies, and of course airlines, and we will convey the message that he raises about making sure that their advice is transparent as possible. Obviously that needs to be done in real time, and I'll certainly consider further the flexibility that he suggested in relation to visas.
Alan Smith. Here.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. I think now is a time where we should be seen to work together, and indeed work together, and thank the Secretary of State for advance sight of the statement. I think now is the time for us also to issue party political point scoring. We in these benches support these changes, and we support this statement. I'd also like to record our appreciation and solidarity with the hard-working FCO staff worldwide, who are doing a very tough job in very tough times, and they themselves have families and indeed respiratory conditions themselves in times. We put our support behind them. So I'd support this statement as far as it goes, but I would urge the Foreign Secretary, and perhaps it's a discussion that he needs to have with the Chancellor as well, I'm conscious there's a statement later on about that, but to go further. And his statement today didn't deal with the point about insurance at all. Now, for Scots and Brits abroad who are stuck and want to get back and are looking to find a way back, the biggest practical help we can do to them right now is to speak to the insurance companies, because their insurance is uppermost in their mind. Now, you'll be aware, the colleagues will be aware of the statement this morning from Sir Charles Bean, the Office of Budgetary Responsibility. I quote, "You need the state to be there as the insurer of last resort against what is effectively an act of God. The state surely has a role. Big, early action is better than half-hearted action that's late." We couldn't agree more. The Chancellor is making a statement later on, but for our nationals who are overseas and want to get back, insurance is their biggest priority. Could I urge the Secretary of State to have a full discussion with the Chancellor on that point, and that the state needs to step in to get our people home?
Can I thank the honourable gentleman and particularly welcome the bipartisan tone that he took. Can I thank him for welcoming the statement, and can I particularly thank him for recognising and paying tribute to the consular staff and the wider FCO teams who, in very difficult circumstances, not least given the advice that we in government have given, are doing a tremendous job. He asked a number of questions about insurance companies. Obviously, they take their lead, at least to some degree, from the travel advice changes. So one of the important things I think it is for the FCO to do is to give very clear and decisive travel advice, which which is one of the reasons, or at least one of the benefits of the statement that we've made today. I certainly take on board his comments about working with the Secretary of State for Transport and the Chancellor to make sure we provide support to the sector, the airline sector, because of course not only is it an important sector in terms of jobs, but we also need them to help get the UK nationals home, because we want to, for the very reasons I made in my statement, allow them to do that through normal commercial means.
Tom Tugundar.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This crisis is causing us to tear apart many aspects of the global system that we have grown used to over the last 20 or 30 years. The threat that it could pose to future scientific cooperation, to future defence against not just pandemics like this, but the poverty that has blighted so much of the world over recent generations is enormous. Can the Foreign Secretary assure me that, as he is planning with his Foreign Office partners or with his Foreign Office staff to rescue and save so many people around the world, he is also looking to cooperate with others to make sure the international community works together to build a proper future based on a shared and prosperous globe?
Can I thank my right honourable friend, the chair of the Select Committee? He's absolutely right, both in terms of the measures we're taking, consular measures to support UK nationals who feel vulnerable or stranded overseas. I also agree with what he's saying about the need for an international approach to pandemics like this. We haven't seen anything like this before. That's why we're providing support to build up the capacity in some of those most vulnerable countries. We're doing that with a total envelope of up to £241 million of aid funding. We're working through the WHO, the Red Cross, UNICEF and other organisations. More generally, the Prime Minister spoke to counterparts in the G7 recently, yesterday in fact, and they agreed on the importance of a stronger, coordinated international approach, and that will include everything from the economic measures that we take through to the research and development to make sure that we have the collaboration to prevent further pandemics happening in the future.
Chris Brown.
Our consular staff are doing an amazing job, and many of them around the world are actually volunteers. They're not paid for their work either. So I hope the Foreign Secretary will pass on our gratitude on behalf of all of our constituents. But can I just tease out this issue about people returning home? Because as I understand the Foreign Secretary's advice, it is that if somebody is thinking of travelling abroad now, they should bear in mind that they may not be able to get back. But at the same time, he's saying that people shouldn't necessarily come back now. That seems to be inconsistent.
Well, can I first of all thank the honourable gentleman for what he said in relation to consular staff. We will pass it on, and it does matter that we can have cross-party support for the essential work that all of our public services are doing. He's asked about travel advice. Obviously, we're advising against all but essential travel globally. It is up to individuals who find themselves to make the individual judgment calls. It will depend on their personal circumstances. It will depend on the availability of commercial flights. And in the last resort, we've been able to provide the repatriation of flights. That is getting more difficult. So we will continue to provide the support, the advice, but ultimately some of those judgment calls will remain an individual decision to be made.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to follow up what the Secretary of State was saying about ferries and the Department of Transport in relation to the UK. Two questions. Will the government please relax today competition law to allow discussion between the three cross-Solent ferry operators to build a resilience plan? They will be in breach of the law if they do not, and lives could depend on it if our ferry services fall over. Secondly, will the government support today the MCA to allow for people to sit in cars during ferry journeys in the UK to protect at-risk groups and for social distancing purpose? Thank you.
Thank honourable friend. He, as ever, raises very important and excellent practical points. They are mainly, I have to say, for the Secretary of State for Transport, but he is, I can reassure my honourable friend, he is talking to the ferry operators as well as the airliners and working together to make sure we get not just the clearest advice, but the most practical advice, so that our constituents and indeed people travelling to the UK or from the UK can make the decisions that they need to make.
Just to help the House, I'm expecting to run this to around 2 o'clock. Alistair Carmichael.
Speaker, the Foreign Secretary is absolutely right. Repatriation is a complex and costly business. But that surely is exactly why it's not something that should just be left to individuals, and there must be a leading role for government in this. Like many MPs, I've had representations this morning from constituents who were on holiday in Morocco who now find themselves stranded. The Ambassador's Twitter account is telling them just to go to the airport with their passport and their ticket and see what they can fix up when they get there. We realise that the consular services are under stress, but surely this is a moment where they have to have every possible resource to provide the best possible information for our constituents.
Well, can I thank the Right Honourable Gentleman? I totally agree with him. We are providing the very best support, care, advice, and of course, when it comes to repatriations, we have secured, I think it was 200 that came back from China at the outset. We're also working in relation to the Braemar cruise ship to secure the return via Havana. I think it's the most intense diplomacy I've had with my Cuban opposite number in my time, but actually I have to say hugely welcome because they've been very cooperative. So we will do everything that we can. Of course, the point I would make to the Right Honourable Gentleman, the situation is very fluid. The decisions that are being made on the ground in countries like the one he suggested often happening very rapidly, and the challenge for airliners but also for the FCO and the consular advice and support we provide is just to make sure that we can respond not just as quickly as possible but as effectively as possible.
Alicia Cairns.
With me that when we talk about the different approach being taken by different countries, the UK has to focus on what is right for our country at the right time, and uniquely we are using behavioural science, which many are not doing, and we need the right response for our culture and the way our people behave, not one transported from another country.
Well, my honourable friend makes a really important point. I take the point that has been raised in this chamber that we need to try and get better and more effective international coordination. That's what the Prime Minister has been pressing for when he spoke to his opposite numbers in the G7 by phone, and that's what I've been pressing for in the Foreign Office. At the same time, in the last analysis, we will take the right measures, and crucially, and every country is a bit different in relation to this, depending on where they are on the curve, we will take the right decisions, the most effective decisions, at the right time. And that's why we've changed our travel advice today, and the Prime Minister announced the measures he announced yesterday.
Hilary Benn.
Very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. The Foreign Secretary rightly said that the government doesn't want British nationals to be stranded overseas, but has, of course, referred to the practical difficulties of getting them all home. Could he tell us what are the exceptional circumstances in which the government would be prepared to act to bring British nationals home, because that will help to inform decisions that individuals make about any travel plans they have?
Can I thank the Right Honourable Member? So I think that constituents reading the FCO travel advice ought to take it on its own terms, not on the basis of any potential last resort contingency measures that may be taken down the line. Obviously, we're very mindful of the vulnerability of all of our constituents, like, for example, on the Braemar cruise ship, which has struggled to find a place to dock in order that we can repatriate the substantial number of UK nationals back to the UK. But the decision will have to be taken on an individual basis by all of our constituents and people up and down the country. What we do is provide the clearest guidance, and unless there is a very good reason, an essential reason to travel, we're saying don't take the risk now because you're at a heightened risk of being stranded in the future.
Dr. Andrew Morrison.
The Foreign Minister has been issuing plaintive appeals on social media for medical supplies to assist in his sanctions-hit country. Setting aside Javad Zarif's accompanying rant against America, what does my right honourable friend think can be done to assist the people of Iran at this difficult time, particularly around sanctions, JCPOA and the IMS debt?
Can I thank my honourable friend and pay tribute to his excellent tenure as Minister, and I thoroughly enjoyed working with him, and of course he's an expert in this field. Let's be very clear about it. The ultimate ultimate responsibility for the predicament that Iran faces is the decisions and the choices by their government in Iran. What we do is make clear that, and we've supported Iran in relation to coronavirus with aid funding, because we recognise that this is an exceptional time, an exceptional period. But fundamentally, beyond the humanitarian assistance and other aid funding that we would provide in those circumstances, the decisions that Iran take will be the ones that will get them out of the hole, the cul-de-sac that they lie in. And in particular right now, as I made clear to the Foreign Minister on the phone yesterday, we expect UK dual nationals in detention in Iran to be released as soon as possible, not least given the heightened risk from COVID-19 which is in those prisons.
Janet Davey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Foreign Secretary for updating the House to do with coronavirus overseas. Now, I have constituents that are in Morocco as well, and one family is with a 4-month-old baby. And I just want to ask, really, are there any plans to bring people back from Morocco? And with this exceptional type of circumstances, would it contribute to any of the decisions that the government will make?
Well, can I thank the Honourable Lady? And of course, anyone in those circumstances will feel anxious and distressed. We will certainly see if we can provide as much support, consular and otherwise, to her constituent as possible. If she'd like to contact me afterwards, or any of the ministerial team, we will take up that case directly. More generally, it will always depend on the restrictions that are being imposed, partly by the governments themselves, including in Morocco, and then also the availability of commercial airlines coming out. What we want to do, what I've been working with the Transport Secretary to achieve, is give clear advice to our constituents, if you like, as a consumer of travel services, but also make sure that we're leaving the window open for commercial airlines to operate, because that is the surest means of getting the number of people back from difficult or vulnerable positions as possible. That is the only way we're going to be able to achieve it. So we do need to keep those commercial lines operating.
Heather Wheeler.
Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend and all the team are working so hard on our consular services too. Unfortunately, we are hearing about certain embassies being shut. The embassy in Kiev is shut, and it's £1.80 a minute to phone the FCO hotline, and it's a 58-minute delay. So is there anything else that my honourable friends can do to help my constituent who's stuck in Kiev, please?
Yeah. Can I thank the Honourable Lady and also pay tribute to her work at the FCO, where she was a doughty Foreign Minister. There's a whole range of practical details about how we can support our constituents that find themselves in difficult positions. I can certainly ask the Minister covering the wider European neighbourhood to speak and see what further can be done in her case. There is travel advice online. There is a specific hotline for parliamentarians. I don't know whether she's had a chance to access that yet. And if there is any further support, I'm very happy to make sure that I and the ministerial team provide it.
Yes, it does. Yes. Caroline Harris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to add my thanks to the FCO staff who are working under really difficult circumstances. But can the Foreign Secretary advise my constituents, Tony and Jill Long, currently stuck in Cyprus? Their flights are cancelled, their hotel room needs vacating, their insurance is about to expire, and the insurance company are only offering to pay retrospective costs when they return to the UK.
Thank you, Honourable Lady. We'll look at all of these cases, in particular where there's a groundswell of UK nationals and constituents being stranded. What we, as I've already informed the House, what we're trying to do is make sure that the reasons why those flights aren't running in and out can be addressed, whether it's the domestic measures that have been announced. The EU has announced measures yesterday, but have exempt the United Kingdom, so that's welcome. And we will continue to work with those local authorities, but also with the airliners, to make sure that there are as many flights as possible to relieve constituents like hers.
Richard Drax.
Mr. Speaker, can I congratulate my right honourable friend for the calm way he's dealing with the situation that is really historic. Can I also raise a point raised by the SNP benches on insurance? Head teachers across the land are raising or have organised trips along with parents who put in a lot of money. And a school down in my constituency, they spent £140,000 getting children out skiing. Now, the insurance companies are referring them to the travel companies, and the travel companies are saying there's no chance of getting their money back unless the FCO specifically restrict travel to that location. Could my right honourable friend just clarify to all the schools across the land, not just in my constituency, what the situation is and what chance they have of getting their money back?
Can I thank my honourable friend and also thank him for the way in which he's raised his question. Of course, the insurance industry make their decisions in a commercial way. Obviously, we and the Transport Secretary are liaising very closely with them, but certainly the call has been made to the Foreign Office to give as clear advice as possible. So we are saying, not least with the Easter holidays coming up, we are advising against all but essential travel globally. Of course, we're not going to make decisions for individual people or families or indeed schools, but it would seem to me that those are the kinds of trips that would have to now be looked at, and we would expect the insurance and the airline industry to follow based on that very clear advice we've now given.
Dr. Philippa Whitford.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Foreign Secretary mentioned that the government have been consulting with the G7, but they have not been consulting with European governments through the European Centre for Disease Control. So can I ask, apart from ideological reasons, why not? They are very concerned that the focus here has been on behavioural science and not epidemiology.
Hear, hear.
Right. Can I thank the Honourable Lady? I think she asked a perfectly reasonable question. Can I reassure her we are taking the best scientific advice that we've got in the UK. The circumstances in different countries will change. Part of that is about the timing and the peak within which the coronavirus hits an individual country. And can I also just address, you said, talked about the cooperation with the EU partners. I am consistently on the phone talking to all of our European partners to make sure that on all of these issues, from the multilateral drive to tackle coronavirus with support for vulnerable countries, research and development, but also the particular logistical issues with getting constituents home, the diplomacy with our European friends has never been more intense.
Caroline Knowles.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent Jamie Harris is stranded on the MV Ocean Endeavour off the coast of Argentina. She is travelling independently, so has no recourse to a tour operator, and flights from Argentina to Europe have been stopped. Will my right honourable friend consider working with flight companies like British Airways, and there are many others, to look at ways that we can bring constituents home when there simply is no other alternative for them?
Can I thank honourable friend? She makes a good point. Of course, for those in South America, more generally, there have been a range of concerns in different countries. Fundamentally, we want to encourage, as I've explained, commercial operators to keep running, because that is the way of easing and repatriating people at scale. But of course, we will look and we will liaise with the airline operators, and the Transport Secretary is already doing that, to make sure that where there are gaps, we can always provide as much support as possible for vulnerable or stranded constituents.
David Lammy.
My constituent Sarah Goodman is stuck in Morocco. She travelled with friends just on Saturday and now is subject to a ban. I've also heard from students on years abroad who are stranded. Can the Secretary of State work on his website to update British nationals who find themselves stranded abroad? And can there be a global strategy? Because there must be people from abroad stuck in our own country who'd like to return home.
Yes, he's absolutely right, and there have been, I think, another honourable member has raised the issue of Morocco, and the African Minister will look at those cases, and I'm sure very happy and able and willing to look at the case that he raises. He makes a good point about the communication. Of course, we're constantly looking to make sure that through the helpline, but also the online advice, that people can get advice in real time. Constituents and honourable members can sign up to receive email updates so that they get them, or indeed follow on Twitter and Facebook. Of course, there is an inherent challenge, which is the pace at which some of these changes are being made, but we're doing everything that we can to make sure that we give updated FCO advice in real time.
Andrew Bowie.
Speaker, I thank my right honourable friend for a statement. Can I ask if there's been any discussion with the oil and gas sector or individual oil and gas companies, given the huge amount of British nationals and their families, many coming from the north east of Scotland, working and living overseas at this time?
Can I thank the honourable member? He raises rightly an issue in relation to employees of a particular sector. We are engaged very closely with those big employers around the world. They're in, and I'm careful to say this, they're in a relatively more comfortable position than others who are either travelling for a short period of time or temporarily. So the priority has been on the most vulnerable or those that might find themselves at risk of being stranded. That's why we've taken the advice today. But he's absolutely right, and we are engaging with substantial employers overseas to see how we can work together to provide the best support for their consumers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I also pay tribute to the FCO staff, including the one who took my call last night at midnight to deal with my constituent's son who's trapped in Guatemala City, where the British Embassy appears to be closed and there are no commercial flights operating. But can I urge the Foreign Secretary to change one thing which came out of that call, which is that they do not appear to be taking details of British citizens who are trapped abroad and whether indeed they have any special needs or what their conditions are, medical needs and so on. If he doesn't have that information, he's not going to be able to triage for either emergency repatriation flights, emergency assistance or other sorts. Please start taking that information and build up a database so we know exactly how many British citizens are trapped, where and what their conditions are.
Can I thank the honourable gentleman both for the warm words he said about the FCO's effort, but also the practical advice he's given us. We will certainly take that back. One point I'll just mention is we're not talking about tens of thousands, we're talking about hundreds of thousands abroad, and therefore, yes, we need to work up as granular picture of the vulnerabilities as possible, but we also, and that's the reason for one of the contributing factors for the change of the travel laws, we also need to give a clear message that people need to be realistic about, given the scale of that challenge, given the unprecedented nature of COVID-19, what we can do.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Following his comments about Iran, does he know if Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe is amongst the political prisoners that Iran has today released? And does not the ability of a highly dangerous disease to spread through a prison not highlight the immorality of detaining people who are wholly innocent?
Can I just say to my right honourable friend, he did an incredible job, not only as Foreign Secretary, but in particular pushing and pressing not just for Nazanin's release, but for all of our dual nationals suffering in Tehran. I spoke to the Foreign Minister yesterday. I've made clear, not least as Iran considers releasing prisoners on a pretty large scale, that there is no excuse for not releasing all of the UK dual nationals on furlough. We are waiting for confirmation in relation to individual cases, but I can assure him that we're getting, I want to be careful and wait until I've got actual confirmation, but this is a high priority for the government, and I raised it, as I said, with Foreign Minister Zarif yesterday.
Angela Reid.
Mr. Speaker, can I compliment the Foreign Secretary on making it clear that essential travel includes the freight services which will keep our supermarkets stocked with food. And whilst I recognise that the Department of Transport will be dealing with this, could he have some words of reassurance for those who do long-haul freight travelling through Europe, that they're not going to be stranded if they're keeping our food supplies up to date and with us?
Well, can I thank the Honourable Lady for the question, the way that she's raised it. I thank her for complimenting the FCO and consular advice. She's absolutely right, and I talked about it with the Transport Secretary and the Prime Minister this morning, the importance of keeping freight flowing, but also, if you're going to do that, making sure that we safeguard the workers that are doing that. Can I also just give her the reassurance in relation to the proposals, the recommendations announced by the President of the European Commission yesterday, which will be considered by the European Council today in relation to the 30-day travel ban for all but essential travel, that medical staff and transporters of goods would be exempt, as well, of course, as UK nationals.
Kevin Holding-Ray.
Mr. Speaker, my constituent Kate Jackson is currently aboard the Silver Seas cruise line that's been refused entry to a number of ports. It's now heading to Darwin, which is expected to be able to dock there, but there's no availability, Darwin, Australia, that is, no availability of flights back from Australia to the UK. Would my rational friend do all he can to repatriate Kate Jackson and her fellow British citizens?
Can I thank my honourable friend? I'm aware of that case. We're working actively on it. Of course, as with all of the cruise ships, The challenge has been to find a place for them to dock, and then also to get, not least given the international component on these cruise ships, international commercial flights home. We are very much focused on it, and I hope to be able to say something more on that particular cruise ship shortly.
Ben Bradshaw.
The last thing our country and economy need on top of coronavirus is the further shock of a hard or no-deal Brexit at the end of this year. So will he and his EU colleagues urgently agree an extension to the current Brexit transition period so that the government and business can focus 100% on the emergency in front of us?
Absolutely. Can I thank the right honourable gentleman? I think, if anything, this shows, not least in our collaboration with Cuban government, which doesn't happen at the level of intensity it has in recent days very often, actually with our close European partners, the case for intensive diplomacy to get this deal done and move on and take the relationship to the next level.
Karen Bradley.
Thank you very much. I thank my right honourable friend for his statement, but can I ask him for reassurance for my constituent Tracy Wood, who contacted me last night regarding her son. He's a Manchester University placement student, currently in Panama. There are no flights in and out of Panama. He's running out of money, and the embassy had advised him to travel via another country. He simply doesn't know where to go because he doesn't know which border will be closed next. Could he please provide reassurance to Mrs Wood?
Thank my right honourable friend, and say first of all, very difficult in those circumstances, particularly travelling to less accessible places, but we will work very closely with all of the airliners and obviously with our network of embassies to provide the support and the advice as soon as possible. If she would like, I'm very happy to look at the specific case, and if she comes and gives me the details of it, we will take that forward with the ministerial team.
Wayne David.
I have three constituents from Bargoed who are stranded in Krakow, and because Poland has closed its international borders, they don't know how long they will be in that country. Can I ask the Secretary of State if he will put together a comprehensive database of all British citizens who are affected in this way, and ensure that basic communication at some point in the not too distant future is sent out to all those individuals?
Well, can I say to the honourable gentleman that we do already have a means of doing that. People can sign up for real-time updates, and indeed MPs, honourable members can as well. I appreciate the difficult situation in Poland. We are working, as I've already said, with all of our European colleagues to make sure that in relation to UK nationals or indeed other nationals that are here, that we can make sure they can get home where they need to.
Jason McCartney.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I praise the Foreign Secretary for his statesmanlike approach this morning? And can I also thank the SNP spokesman as well for his constructive approach? It's really good to see opposition politicians rising to the occasion, just as our constituents want us to during this crisis. Mr. Speaker, I have constituents stranded in Morocco and Vietnam. Can we please make sure that helplines at consulates and embassies are manned 24 hours to help our constituents? And with constituents as well in Portugal in a motorhome looking to get home, can we also make sure that provisions are made for crossing borders for those wanting to come home across land borders?
Can I thank the honourable friend and also agree with him on the importance of having, within the confines of a democratic institution like this, as constructive approach to this, because it will make it more effective. We will look very carefully at all the issues that he raised. He mentioned, I think he mentioned Vietnam as one of the difficult areas. We're aware, as ministers have already made clear, of a number of British nationals in quarantine, some in hotels, some in other quarantine facilities. We're in very close contact with the Vietnamese authorities. We're providing assistance to all those affected, and we're hoping to see them moved to improved and better facilities as soon as possible. That's just one illustration in pretty difficult, challenging conditions where we're working very hard to try and make sure his constituents and many others get the care, the advice and the support they need.
Kirsten Oswald.
It's very clear, listening to the contributions from across the House, that there are citizens stuck in many and varied countries, far-reaching countries across the world. What plans does the Secretary of State have to work with European partners, specifically to bring people in far-flung places back as a partnership approach?
She raised an excellent point, and we do need to work in partnership. We did that in relation to the flights from Wuhan at the outset of the crisis, if I can put it that way. We've done it in relation to the Bremer cruise ship, and in fact, my instinctive reflex, and the one of this government, is wherever we've got a situation where UK nationals are stranded and we've got more capacity on the airlines to get them home, our instinctive reaction is to make sure that our European, our Five Eyes partners and their nationals can get on as well. And we've had good collaborative arrangements, and it's been a two-way relationship, and all of that will continue.
Peter Roberts.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm most grateful to the Foreign Secretary for his very comprehensive and thorough statement. I appreciate this may be an issue for other departments, but can he clarify the position with regard to private planes, whether commercial or private leisure, flying in to local airfields?
I think that's probably one for the Department for Transport, but I wasn't clear whether he was asking in relation to their use for repatriation or whether restrictions were being extended to them. I think in any event, I probably ought to pass that on to the experts, the Department for Transport.
Coyle.
The Foreign Secretary is stating quite openly that the government will not bring everyone home. So how is he working with operators like TUI to ensure they act responsibly and don't leave people stranded abroad without communications, like my constituent Michelle Choi in Morocco?
Thank the honourable gentleman. It's not so much we won't, it's just a pure question of capacity, given the potential range of hundreds of thousands of UK nationals travelling temporarily abroad. What we will do is liaise very closely with, I think the honourable gentleman is the third to raise the issue of Morocco. We'll look very carefully at what more that can be done. The African Minister is nodding earnestly. I know we'll take that up. We're also, of course, and he's absolutely right to nail this point, trying to work with the airlines to make sure, as these travel restrictions come into place, there is a window where the commercial airlines can come in and get as many of people who want to come out away and back to the UK as possible.
Mark Pritchard.
I agree with the Foreign Secretary. We can't repatriate everybody. It's just physically impossible. But following on from the very good question from the Right Honourable Member for Leeds Central on questions of exceptional circumstances, on those most vulnerable, and given that we've been told by our own Prime Minister we are at war with an invisible enemy, the COVID-19 virus, can I ask what discussions he's had with the Ministry of Defence about deploying the Royal Air Force and the Royal Navy, and even using bases around the world as staging posts if needs be, when those international airlines further restrict flights, to repatriate the most vulnerable, not everybody, but the most vulnerable?
Can I thank my honourable friend? Obviously, I've engaged very closely with the Defence Secretary on this, but something like that would be a last resort. We don't rule anything out at this stage, but our focus has been on making sure, and I think the point the honourable gentleman made and others have made, working very closely, not just with the international airlines, but other countries, to make sure that together, and in relation to some of the cruise ships that we're dealing with at the moment, where we haven't repatriated them, this is happening, where we can work together as an international team to try and get UK nationals back. So that is definitely a partnership that will involve international governments around the world, but also the airlines around the world.
I've currently got a female constituent stuck in Istanbul. All flights are being cancelled from the UK to Turkey until mid-April. The airline Pegasus is not being helpful, and she's been told she's only got a 25% chance of getting home. The Secretary of State's hotline advised that she keeps in touch with the airline, but as I said, they're not being helpful, and nor have the consular support in Istanbul. And she doesn't have any insurance. What support can the government give her?
Can I thank the honourable lady? Look, it's very distressing, and obviously as MPs we'll do everything we can. I'm very happy to look at that case. I'll ask the Minister for Europe to take a close look. We, of course, will continue to liaise with the Turkish authorities and as many of the airlines that go into Istanbul or indeed Ankara as possible, to try and make sure that people don't find themselves in that vulnerable position.
Teresa Villiers.
A constituent of mine has been in touch about his grandparents, Alan and Beatrice. Beatrice is 86, Alan is 89, and they are trapped on board the Silver Shadow cruise ship, which is quarantined off Recife in Brazil. Can I appeal to the Foreign Secretary for his help to get Alan and Beatrice home?
I thank my right honourable friend. We've been following very carefully the the course of the Silver Shadow. I can tell her there are 300 passengers on board, around 120 are British nationals, which goes to the point I was raising earlier about this needing to be an international team effort. Royal Caribbean, the parent company of the ship, has indicated that they will offer at least 3 charter flights to get passengers home, one to the UK, one to the US, one to Canada, possibly also one to Australia. That gives her a sense not just of the challenge we face, but also how we're striving every sinew to deal with constituents like her own.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to add my voice to thanking those FCO workers who are, I'm sure, working around the clock and wanting themselves to get home but are staying to help others. I've been listening very carefully to what the Secretary of State has been saying about repatriation. I understand his arguments about the airlines, but we have to accept the reasons why the airlines aren't running the flights is because they can't afford to, and they are worried about coming out the other end. Would he be considering a subsidy for the airlines to enable them to run these flights, particularly from areas where flights have been cancelled or shut down completely?
Can I thank the Honourable Lady? I think she raises a really important point, which is that on the one hand we do want commercial airlines to flow, but clearly they're under severe financial pressure given the domestic restrictions being placed, and indeed, of course, other governments, including our own, changing their travel advice. We will work with the airlines to find and see what support we can provide, and our priority continues to be to make sure commercial flights can access as many areas as possible to get people back in the kind of scale and volume that is necessary to address the challenge we face.
It's good to know that we now have clarity on global travel over the next 30 days. But to put constituents' minds at rest, can my right honourable friend confirm that travel agents and airlines should be issuing refunds to those cancelling for travel arrangements over the next 30 days, and not particularly the insurance companies?
Well, I'm not going to give legal advice or commercial advice to either the operators or the insurers, but what I can tell my honourable friend is that the Transport Secretary is engaged very closely with all of the different sectors to make sure that we protect consumers, the passengers who find themselves at risk. And indeed, the Transport Secretary is nodding earnestly on that very point.
Kevin Brennan.
Quite rightly, honourable members mentioned the case of Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe in Iran, but can I also ask the Foreign Office not to lose sight of people like Luke Simons, my constituent who's held captive by the Houthis in Yemen at this time, and in any discussions with the Iranian authorities, if there's any pressure that can be brought to bear through that channel, and welcome the new Middle East Minister to his post and hope that he'll get into the detail of this case as his predecessor did.
I thank the honourable gentleman. He's absolutely right. And just to be clear, when I speak to any of our Iranian interlocutors, we raise every case of dual nationals or indeed the British Council employee that has been detained. And of course that applies consistently across the board, and I know the Middle East Minister will be very happy to meet with the honourable gentleman to discuss the specific case, and I will always be willing to raise it and try and secure the release of all of our nationals and dual nationals in those terrible conditions across the world.
Laura Trott.
Mr. Speaker, I have 2 separate cases of constituents stranded in Peru, one of whom is a young woman travelling on her own. I understand the stress that our consular service is under at the moment, but they cannot get through to the embassy nor to the emergency hotline. Will my right honourable friend look at their case urgently and do all that he can to get them home?
Can I thank my honourable friend? Of course, we'll look at those cases. Those areas where we don't have a large or substantial consular presence, obviously we're going to have to innovate and still provide as best we can the practical advice and the consular support, and I know that the relevant Minister will be very happy to meet with her and take forward those cases, and I'm very happy to raise them as well with my interlocutors.
Patrick Brady.
What discussions is he having with the Home Secretary about foreign nationals in this country who find themselves in a similar situation? I have a constituent who is self-isolating in line with guidance and yet is being told that her visa will be overstayed and needs to leave the country. So what thought is the government giving to these kind of situations, especially if, when they get to the end of their quarantine, there are no flights home?
Can I thank the honourable gentleman? Of course, we've got foreign nationals here who are in very similar positions to the ones that UK nationals find them in around the world. We will, of course, look at those cases as sympathetically and as constructively as possible. We know what it's like from all the cases that we've got coming through to the FCO and through our consular services, and I have already raised this issue with the Home Office and the Home Secretary, but we will then reaffirm it based on what he said today.
Stephen Hammond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Earlier on, the Foreign Secretary spoke about hundreds of thousands of UK nationals who are abroad. Many, of course, are travelling home and therefore may be taking longer than they expect. And therefore, can the Foreign Office be clear about reciprocal medical arrangements in place in those areas? Many, of course, are UK citizens living in EU states which we were formerly a partner with. Given the medical officer this morning said it might last for 18 months, could he be asking EU partners or former EU partners to consider an elongation of the reciprocal arrangements that are in place currently?
Can I thank the honourable member, my honourable friend, for the dual way in which he both raised an excellent question but also managed to leverage very subtly in the whole question of Brexit Phase 2 negotiations. Of course, you'll know into the end of the transition period, the reciprocal arrangements are in place. The question of their continuation beyond would be for the negotiators to consider, but what we will always make sure is that we provide as much support as we possibly can for UK nationals on the continent, but also for European nationals here.
Nick Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many constituents have contacted me about the differing approaches of other countries, not least to the issue of testing. I appreciate different countries are at different stages of the outbreak, but can the Foreign Secretary reassure me that expertise and experience from all around the world is going to be fed into our approach on a daily basis?
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman. He's right to note that different countries are acting in different ways. Some of that is, as he says, because they're at different stages in the peak and the trough of dealing with coronavirus. But I can reassure him, based on my attendance at COBRA meetings, that not only are we making sure we follow the best UK scientific evidence available, but that is in itself tapping the widest research base possible and the widest range of experts in effectively stopping the spread of disease.
Ben Everett.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Members in this House and, of course, journalists outside of it are perfectly at liberty to ask what lessons we have learnt from our European partners. But it's worth reminding the House that the Chief Medical Officer that is leading the response to this crisis is a Professor of Epidemiology. He is literally the right man in the right job at the right time. The Foreign Secretary updated on his conversations with our European partners, but perhaps he could update on conversations with other international partners as well, such as the US and other global institutions.
Well, can I thank my honourable friend? He's absolutely right to pay tribute to Professor Whitty, but also Sir Patrick Vallance. We've got some of the very finest expert evidence coming to us in the world. And on his broader point, yes, we're talking to our European partners, and of course UK nationals are in European countries in large numbers, particularly looking in Spain and France, but also others. But I can reassure him that I'm talking to my opposite numbers from around the world, from Central America to Asia Pacific, from North America, both Canada and the United States, and we will continue to do so.
Andy Slaughter.
Deputy Speaker, those of us who represent large numbers of EU citizens are hearing concerning accounts of what's happening in their home countries. There are towns in northern Italy of a similar size to many of our constituencies that have seen thousands of cases of the virus and hundreds of deaths. I assume the Foreign Secretary is getting like responses from our embassies around the world. Are these being used to inform the UK response, even if that's a worst-case scenario?
Yes, can I thank the honourable gentleman? He's right that we need to learn and try and understand a bit more about COVID-19 and what its impact will be in the UK based on the experience that we're seeing in real time across the world. Of course, that's being fed in via the scientists, via the Department for Health and Social Care, and we're making sure that we've got, at the end of that pipeline, practical advice, which is why we're taking the decisions that we're taking on travel advice today.
James Sunderland.
Madam Deputy Speaker, could I please ask the Secretary of State to reassure the House that appropriate medical support is readily available for British government and military personnel overseas, and that specialist medical evacuation will be available for them in extremis?
We take very seriously, and thank the honourable gentleman for his question, we take very seriously the security and the protection of all of our UK personnel, Foreign Office, MOD, DFID, right across, both in the UK, but right across the network, and we will do everything we can to make sure that they can do the pretty heroic job that they're doing right now in safe and secure conditions.
Gavin Newlands.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. This measure is entirely commensurate with the situation we face and I support it. However, as the Member of Parliament for Glasgow Airport and the thousands of jobs that it supports, can I ask what assessment the Government have made of the impact of the COVID-19 measures on the industry? And by industry I mean airlines, airports, baggage handlers, etc., etc. The list could go on. What assessment they've made of the impact and what the Government are going to do to support them?
Thank the honourable gentleman and say that we're very conscious that of the challenge for the airline industry and all the related sectors. We're also very conscious to make sure that we take, I think he described it as a commensurate policy approach in the Foreign Office, given the knock-on effects that it will have. So I talk regularly, as I did this morning, with the Secretary of State for Transport as well as the Prime Minister, and we will, and he of course liaises directly with the airports and the airlines, but we are making sure we take the most proportionate approach that we can. Ultimately, we've got to make sure that we protect UK nationals based abroad, but we also need to make sure we protect the industry, which is going to help them get home.
Rob Butler.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I echo the compliments that we've heard across the House for UK consular staff overseas. I recognise they have limited resources, but I wonder whether my right honourable friend could consider whether there's any scope for them to offer at least a basic service at weekends.
Well, I can reassure honourable friend that Foreign Office staff are working round the clock, round weekends. Of course, there is an issue in relation to some of these countries about their own personal safety. We're giving advice here. It's important ministers, officials follow that advice, and we also need to look after and protect their safety. But notwithstanding that, I would have to say that there is certainly not a 9 to 5 or a Monday to Friday approach. Far from it. It is round the clock, right the way through the week, and we are striving every sinew to make sure that constituents, however far-flung the places they found themselves in, are getting the most support and the most clear guidance and practical help that we can give them.
Stephen Kinnock.
Speaker, just following on from the question from my colleague, the Honourable Member for Exeter, could I just press the Foreign Secretary on this issue of the talks on the future relationship with the European Union? They're incredibly complex and multifaceted talks. They're absorbing a tremendous amount of government time and attention. Rather than trying to fight this war on two fronts, if you like, and stretching government bandwidth to breaking point, surely the time is now coming to request an extension to the transition period, and it's better to do that than to put ideology ahead of the health and safety of the British people.
I'm sure the honourable gentleman would never put his ideological desire to stay in the EU ahead of the practical diplomacy that we face in the months ahead. But I understand why he's asked the question. I think that, as far as I'm aware, the negotiations can still proceed, given all of the logistical arrangements that can be put in place. We're confident that we can get this done, and actually I don't think delaying Brexit negotiations would give anyone the certainty on either side of the channel that they need.
Kate Green. Kate Green.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I echo the concerns of other colleagues about the situation for British nationals in Peru, where I have a constituent with serious underlying health condition who is stranded, and as we've heard, not only is the British Embassy apparently closed, but the phone number which they are being informed they can use to obtain information is apparently not being answered. In addition to needing information about how they can be assisted to leave the country, they need assistance and information while they remain in the country, including about access to healthcare. Can the Foreign Secretary take a very careful look at the situation in Peru?
I thank her for the constructive and detailed way that she's raised her constituent's case. Of course, I'm very happy to look at those cases. The Minister covering Central and South America has already indicated in relation to some of the other cases with respect to Peru that she will take those up. We will look to do everything we can, both to provide the support and advice, and for those that need to return, to provide them with the means to do so.
Tim Farron.
Thank you. I've written to him about my constituent, Eddie, who is 19, who's stranded in Morocco. I hope he will intervene to bring him and others home. But travel is also vital for the nation's supplies. 45% of the food that Britain eats comes from overseas and is imported. So will the government do two things? First of all, make a statement very, very soon on how it's going to protect those supply lines to give the nation confidence in its food supplies, and then secondly, do everything it can to back Britain's farmers so they can increase production to keep us all well fed.
The Honourable Gentleman, in relation to his constituent, I of course will look at that very carefully. There's a number of other Moroccan cases that have been raised, but and I'll get back to him with as clear a steer as possible. He's right to raise all the issues he has around supply chains. Again, that was one of the issues that I discussed with the Transport Secretary. We are very mindful, and if you will have heard the changes to the travel advice that I've announced, they will not apply to freight. So we are very mindful in everything we do to keep those supply chains open, and we'll continue to look at that. And he also makes a very good and important point about food supply and frankly the opportunities for UK-based suppliers to rise to meet some of the demand or the supply that will be curtailed as a result of COVID-19.
Navendu Mishra.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I've written to the Secretary of State regarding a constituent stranded in Austria, and I'm told there's a lack of testing kits and issues around travelling back. Adding to that, there's already enough chaos around the issue of repatriation, and that is even before the majority of countries move into emergency lockdown phases or close their tourist venues. Can the Secretary of State confirm that the Foreign Office has all the resources it needs to provide extra consular support, and it is very likely that UK nationals will be caught up in these fast-moving situations?
Yeah. Thank him for this question. Of course, we'll look very carefully at any case he's written to me on about constituents in Austria. There's no doubt about it that the Foreign Office, as with the rest of government, most obviously the NHS, is going to come under pressure. The key thing is that we have got the means and the agility to prioritise to make sure that dealing with COVID-19 is the top priority as we go through this challenge. I'm very clear the Foreign Office will do everything we can to protect our constituents, UK nationals abroad, and also make sure that we work with our international partners to rise to this challenge, get through it, and then move on so that we can get back to some semblance of normality.
Jim Shannon.
Deputy Speaker. First of all, can I thank the Minister for his commitment and for him and his staff's sterling efforts on behalf. We're very encouraged by what he said today. Minister, in the island of Ireland, both north and south, people travel from Northern Ireland southwards to attend churches, to participate in meetings, to preach at meetings. Can the Minister give us some direction what should happen? People across all of Northern Ireland wish to know, should they attend their churches? Should their churches be suspended or closed? What should we do? I believe that this great nation of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland should pray to their God for help at this time as well. This is a time for prayer, so would the Minister join with me and others to ask for that call and support that call today?
I thank the Honourable Gentleman and say I totally understand the point he makes. I think the obvious thing is to keep following the government's medical advice, and in relation to devolved advice, the advice given by the Northern Ireland Executive. Can I also give him reassurance in relation to the latest announcement by the Irish Government that all persons entering Ireland from overseas will be asked to self-quarantine for 14 days. That will not apply to Northern Ireland by virtue of the land border, and the Irish believe that as a result of the land border they can maintain social distancing. So I hope that gives his constituents and indeed the people of Northern Ireland a measure of reassurance.
Clive Betts.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I appreciate the Foreign Secretary may have to raise this issue that I'm raising with him with other colleagues, but people are naturally drawing comparisons between the actions in this country, say, of advice against going to pubs and restaurants and places of entertainment, with the position in France and other countries where such visits are banned completely. Would he appreciate that does cause confusion for people, and also business in this country are more likely to put at risk of failure because of the less rigorous position we are taking?
Can I thank the Honourable Gentleman? I understand the point he's raised, and I think it's a fair question. But the reason is, first of all, because we're following the scientific advice that applies to the UK, and second of all, that COVID-19 is affecting different countries at different paces, and some of them are at a different place on the curve in terms of the spread of the of coronavirus than the UK. So we will make the right decisions at the right time for the best interests of people in this country, including our businesses, and we'll do it based on the scientific advice, which is very carefully taking into account the different approaches and the different pace at which they're trying to deal with coronavirus in Europe, but also across the world.
Karen Buck.
Madam Speaker, whilst hugely appreciative of the pressure that consular staff are under, for everybody who has a loved one, particularly a vulnerable loved one, trapped in this situation, it is the end of the world. I have a constituent on the Silver Spring cruise ship outside Darwin, who is 78 years old and extremely poor health, and we are being told that there are issues about the financial viability of the cruise line and the safety of supplies. I have a constituent in Peru who has multiple problems and whose mother is desperate. I have a case in from Morocco this morning. They are coming in every few hours. Can the Minister help with those? And can we also be assured that there is a review taking place of capacity so that we can urgently upscale it, at least for these coming weeks?
Can I thank the Honourable Lady? Can I reassure her that in both the cases that she's referred to, we're actively looking at the solutions that we can provide for UK nationals. She's right to raise the issue of scalable support. I'm making sure that all the resource that is available is going to be focused on coronavirus in the weeks ahead. So, of course, there's an element of scalability. We've got the resilience to get through this crisis, and I'm confident that we will.
Alison Thewlis.
Speaker, I want to raise another case of people stuck in Morocco. I have a case raised with me today of a family with 3 young children who I understand were due to fly back on the 24th of March, but flights have now been suspended. Could I have some clarity on when they can come home to Glasgow, because they are stockpiling food at the moment and just don't know when they can get back? What advice can he offer?
Well, can I say that the Africa Minister has already made clear he's going to follow up on all of those cases, so we will certainly look at the case of the Honourable Lady's constituent, follow the real-time advice. I'm writing to all honourable members with the practical advice, how they can stay up to date with real-time, and we will continue to give the Honourable Lady, and as indeed all honourable members, as much advice as swiftly as possible to provide for the safety but also the return of her constituents.
Mike Ainsbury.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Many constituents up and down the country are doing the right and inevitable thing and cancelling Easter holidays. But far too many are doing the hokey-pokey between the travel agents, the advice from the FCO and the insurance companies. What more can the Secretary of State do to give people a nudge in the right direction?
Well, can I thank the Honourable Gentleman? I think the clarity of the advice that we've given today will provide the nudge, to use the Honourable Gentleman's expression. The most important thing we can do, both for our constituents but also for the airline industry and indeed the insurers, is to give clear advice. We've done that. We're advising against all but essential global travel, and we will watch as I'm confident the airline industry and the insurers take the responsible approach in response to that.
Alan Bryan.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I agree with the advice that non-essential passenger travel should be halted at the moment, and the Foreign Secretary said that freight channels should remain open. The thing is about air freight, so much air freight actually goes on passenger carrying planes, so therefore the empty seats have to be paid for either by industry or by the government. So what work's the government done to identify critical routes, critical airlines and the support packages required to keep the freight channels going and keep the airlines going?
I can assure the Honourable Gentleman that we discussed that issue, discussed it with the Transport Secretary. He's in conversations with the airliners. He's right, there's not a clear division between freight and passenger travel. They often go on the same aircraft. We're very conscious of this, and we'll be working with the industry to make sure that we can chart a sustainable path ahead as possible. But we've got to take of course, time's critical. We're in daily touch with all the relevant interlocutors, including the airlines and the airports. But also, I think it's important that we take this measure now, not least given some of the comments that have been raised in the House about travel arrangements over the Easter period.
Claudia Ware.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Like many of my constituents, I too have family members stuck abroad. In my case, an older aunt stuck in the US. I certainly look forward to her healthy return, along with the rest of my constituents' family members, once there's a global strategy in place. My friend, the member the Honourable Member for Islington South and Finsbury was right to highlight the global leadership and global response that is required. And in that regard, is it not one of the other lessons that we must learn from the COVID-19, the need for a joint mechanism to guide coordinated global efforts on the development, testing and rollout of potential cures and vaccines, potentially with the establishment of a dedicated body responsible for this work? Would the Foreign Secretary undertake to look into that proposal today?
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for the emphasis she puts on international coordination. There are multilateral efforts to make sure we deal with everything from research and development to going to vaccines, but also capacity building for the most vulnerable countries. I'm certainly happy to look at any proposals she wants to write to me with, look at the detail of it. The challenge, of course, has been different approaches, partly driven by different assessments of the risk, but also just the pace at which and the geography with which coronavirus has spread.
Deirdre Brock.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Secretary of State mentioned the Irish Government's announcement of a mandatory 14-day self-quarantine period. The Australian Prime Minister has recently announced the same issue for any passengers arriving in Australia from abroad. Is that an option the UK Government is actively considering?
The Honourable Lady, I mean, that's ultimately the responsibility of the Home Secretary, but what I can say to her is that given the changes that we're making on travel advice, it wouldn't seem that it was necessary, nor indeed is the scientific advice that we're getting suggesting that that's a measure that we should take at this time.
I thank the Foreign Secretary. Thank you very much. We now come to the 10-minute rule motion. Karen Bradley.